In the grand story of ancient Rome, behind the marble statues, the golden palaces, and the thunder of legions conquering the world were women who lived in silence. Women who were taken from their homes, stripped of their names, and sold as possessions. They were the slave women of Rome, and their story is darker than we can ever imagine. When Roman armies swept through Europe, Africa, and the East, their victories were celebrated with pomp and glory. But for women, especially the young and able-bodied, victory meant something else. They were seized as part of the spoils of war, torn from their villages in Gaul, Greece, or Judea, forced to march long distances, bound together by ropes, often barefoot, without food or water. Some carried children in their arms. Many never saw their husbands, fathers, or brothers again, for the men were slaughtered while the women were dragged away. For generals like Julius Caesar or Pompey, slaved captives were wealth. Tens of thousands of women filled the slave markets after each conquest, their bodies seen as merchandise to be traded. Imagine the slave markets of Rome, platforms lined with frightened women forced to stand half-clothed so that buyers could inspect their bodies. On their necks hung placards listing their origins, their age, their skills, and sometimes their defects. Greek women, valued for their education, might be purchased for tutoring or companionship. Gaulish women, admired for their strength, often sold into farm labor or brothels. Syrian and Egyptian women were prized for their beauty, sold as concubines to the wealthy. The auctioneer's hammer decided their fate. A household servant, a prostitute, a concubine, a gladiatrix. Their future was written in the gavel's echo. Most Roman slave women ended up in private homes, villas of the rich or insulae of the middle class. Their tasks ranged from grinding grain and weaving cloth to cleaning, cooking, and nursing children. But life inside the villa was not safety. These women had no legal protection. Their bodies belonged entirely to their masters. They could be beaten for mistakes, punished for disobedience, or used at their master's will. Roman law treated them as property, not persons. Some mistresses, the matronae, ruled their female slaves with iron discipline. Letters from elite Roman women show contempt, describing slave girls as lazy, deceitful, or troublesome. And yet, in secret, some of these women formed bonds, whispering in kitchens, sharing stories of the lands they had lost. For many, memory was the only treasure they could not be robbed of. For countless others, there was no household work. They were sent directly into Rome's thriving sex industry. In the city streets, in smoky taverns and dimly lit brothels, slave women were forced into prostitution. Owners branded or tattooed them to mark their status, and the money they earned never belonged to them. Graffiti from Pompeii tells us their names, often just nicknames, scratched on walls by customers. It also tells us the prices, shockingly low, because the demand was endless, and the supply always renewed by conquest. For these women, every night was another loss of dignity, and yet Roman men boasted of visiting them as if it were a sign of status and virility. Disobedience had consequences. Slave women who resisted were punished publicly to make examples of them. Whippings, branding with hot irons, even mutilation. Some were forced to wear iron collars inscribed with warnings, "If you find me, return me to my master." And the ultimate punishment for rebellion or escape was crucifixion. Historians record entire rows of crosses filled with slaves along Roman roads, a grim reminder that resistance meant death. For women, the terror was doubled. They faced both the lash of authority and the private cruelties of those who owned them. A small but horrifying fate awaited a few: the gladiatorial arenas.
Some slave women were trained as gladiatrices, female gladiators, forced to fight for the amusement of Roman crowds. Though rare, these spectacles shocked audiences. Writers described them with fascination and scorn, marveling at the unnatural sight of women fighting with swords. For those women, every fight was a sentence to humiliation or death. Not all stories ended in despair. A small number of slave women gained freedom through loyalty, beauty, or fortune. Some became trusted companions, concubines elevated into households. Others were granted manumission, formal release, and lived as freed women, sometimes even marrying Roman citizens. Yet, even freedom carried a shadow. Society never let them forget their past. Many were branded in youth, scars they could never erase. Their stories remind us survival was possible, but dignity was almost always lost.
Roman historians rarely mentioned these women. Their lives were invisible, buried beneath the grand stories of generals, senators, and emperors. What little we know comes from scraps, legal texts, graffiti, fragments of letters. Through these, we glimpse not just their labor, but their suffering. And in that silence lies the greatest tragedy. A whole population of women lived, worked, loved, suffered, and died without their voices being heard.
Rome prided itself on civilization, on law, on order. But the same society that celebrated freedom for its citizens built that freedom on slavery. Senators debated philosophy while slave women scrubbed their floors. Poets praised love and virtue while visiting brothels filled with enslaved girls. The contradiction was stark, but rarely acknowledged. The glory of Rome came at the cost of its most vulnerable. Despite the fear, some women resisted in small ways. They whispered forbidden prayers, stole scraps of food for their children, or carved secret messages into walls. In Pompeii, graffiti records the voices of slaves, sometimes mocking their masters, sometimes declaring love for another captive. These fragments show us that even in chains, women held on to pieces of themselves. Some masters took female slaves as concubines. A few were treated with favor, even freed and married. But for most, these relationships were exploitation dressed as affection. A slave woman had no power to refuse. What looked like intimacy was often just another form of control. And yet, some children were born from these unions, blurring the lines between master and slave. Rome's bloodlines were marked by the women they sought to erase. Some slave women found hope in religion. In the later empire, Christianity spread among the enslaved, offering a promise of equality before God. For women who had been told they were less than human, these words were fire in the darkness. Faith gave them dignity, even when Rome denied it. The glory of Rome was built on conquest, but beneath that glory were chains. The empire's triumphs came at the cost of women's freedom, dignity, and humanity. Their story is not written in marble or gold, but in scars. And though their names are forgotten, their silence still speaks.